Welcome back to Taiwan Outlook. Our guest today is Mr. Erping Zhang. He's a spokesperson for Falun Gong, and Dr. Ansley, a China scholar for more than 4 decades. Mr. Zhang, you just mentioned that it appears to many people that China is now changing the behavior of other countries, especially in terms of human rights. And China is tightening up its control over the media, over the internet, and so on. What can we do to respond to China's more aggressiveness in terms of tightening the control?
Well, when I first went to the United States, that was in 1984. And when President Reagan was running a presidential campaign against Walter Mondale, I was very impressed by one thing that President Reagan said. He was calling the former Soviet Union the evil empire. Mm-hmm. And he was correct. And when he was saying that, later I was reading a report which talk about the prisoner of conscience and outspoken intellectuals in former Soviet Union's labor camps. And these people cried when they heard that President Reagan called the communist system an evil empire. And he told Gorbachev to tear down the wall. And it sent a message that the Western leaders were standing up for the values, for the, were firm, when they engage with the former Soviet Union. But today, when we look at, the Western countries, it appears that the economic interests oversees, all the other concerns. And I noticed when I first came to the United States that the Western country becomes strong and powerful because of 2 assets. First, you have material assets because you have a strong military and economic base. The second asset is the moral assets. That's the democratic, and value system. But the first assets actually came from the second assets. If the Western country lose the moral assets, then their material assets will not be holding much longer. And the same thing when you are dealing with China. What would China be if it's a powerful state with a strong military and economic power, and yet it's ruled by a dictatorship? Mm-hmm. And we just don't hope to see another repeat of the Third Reich in the 30s coming up in the coming decades. So that's a scary thought.
But the thing is, as Mr. Zhang just mentioned, that China is now becoming more powerful economically and militarily. And China has been very skillfully using its market, its economic power to influence other countries' attitudes toward China. Do you think that other countries are now more coming to terms, or coming to China's terms, in terms of human rights?
Yes, I've seen that happening in a number of spheres in the West. And it hasn't just been happening, it doesn't happen by accident. One of the problems we're facing today is that China has been very effective in penetrating Western societies and penetrating virtually all institutions of Western societies until we've gotten to the point where many of these institutions are either suppressing information, keeping quiet, or they're parroting information that they get from Beijing, and they're really acting in the interests of Beijing. We've seen a tremendous shrinking of academic curiosity in universities. We've seen universities that have had their funding cut by their own governments, and in order to make up that missing funding, they've gone to China, in effect. And they've been told by their governments to be entrepreneurial and raise their own funds. The result is that study programs and human rights seminars on China and so forth are disallowed by many universities right around the West. They won't allow these people to come onto campus. When I was a student, and that may identify me as a dinosaur, but going back a few years, universities were crucibles of contending thought. Every viewpoint was welcome on campus. Didn't matter how radical or how outrageous it was. If you disagreed with it, then you could argue against it, but you didn't suppress it. But nowadays, many universities in the West will simply not tolerate seminars on forums on human rights in China. We find our media hugely affected in the West in many, many ways. We had a absolutely disgusting and shameful incident just recently in Canada, where the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation withdrew a film 5 hours before it was scheduled to go on. This was called Beyond the Red Wall, and it was a hard-hitting film focusing on the persecution of Falun Gong in China. 5 hours before it was scheduled to go, it was withdrawn after a telephone call to CBC from the Chinese consulate. There was a firestorm around the world. I think 127 newspapers denounced CBC, and they were so much on the defensive. They said, all right, we'll show it. When they showed it, it was a severely doctored version. And one of the things they cut out, absolutely, was references to the analogy between the 1936 Berlin Olympics and the 2008 Olympics. And that's just a question of free speech. And the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation simply decided that Canadians should not be allowed to hear those kinds of thoughts.
But if this trend continues, apparently all the countries will be vulnerable to China's influence over its domestic issues as well. Or China does not have freedom of speech, and then sooner or later we will lose our freedom of speech as well.
That's right.
What can we do about it?
Well, I think the Beijing soft power has two elements. The first element is the part that Clive just mentioned, to influence the domestic policy of foreign countries, and that's what we usually call, it's interference of domestic affairs. And there's another element of the Beijing soft power, which is called the charm offensive, which means to improve the Western perception of China, and the use of culture exchange, academic exchange programs, and using money, using trade, and using buying shares of your foreign companies to essentially to influence your perception. And it's quite powerful because most people today in the West, and through self-censorship and through this charm offensive, and through this all sorts of coercive measures, are really self-disciplining themselves. And one of the most powerful thing that in the denial of the organ theft by many Western countries is the fact that they cannot live up to their conscience. What if this is true? If this is true, then the Western countries must change their policy with China. Because how could you trade and do business as usual with Beijing in the face of the fact that people's organs are being taken out, for profit in the international market? And this is no less crime than the Holocaust. I would say it's a new form of evil in this day and age. So many people rather to deny it so that they can live better, with their conscience, and rather look away, when massive abuse, including the others it's mentioned about the crackdown on the Christians and Tibetans and other groups. So this sense of the guilt, guiltless or whatever, is really chewing up the conscience of the West. And that's why it's so important we have people. But I'm trying to, I think we also have to be hopeful and positive, because we have people like David Kilgore and Clive and many others, who are committed to the values, and we just need to do a better job to wake up more people in the West. And here I hope more people in Taiwan will come to realization that to expect Beijing will automatically self-behaving and become better is like expecting the wolf to become vegetarian.
Yeah, but I think Taiwan is not unique in terms of its immunity to China's influence. No. Many countries are now influenced by China. There was even a joke now that is many countries' China policy is actually made in China. In other words, China has influenced other countries' policy toward China in different ways. Yeah. Are you concerned about that too?
Well, I'm very concerned about that, because that's a very sensitive topic to me, because it's not a joke. You said this is a joke going around, but as a Canadian, we had a government prior to the one that we have right now, in which it was absolutely true. It was no joke. Canadian China policy was made in Beijing, not in Ottawa, for all those years. And when Erping talks about Beijing buying shares in Canadian corporations, what they did in Canada's case was they bought shares in our prime ministers, and they owned the last two prime ministers before the one that we have now. We had a prime minister who, on his last trip to China, stood up at a press conference with Jiang Zemin and made the statement that China has made tremendous progress, huge strides in human rights over the last 10 years under the leadership of President Jiang Zemin. We had his successor, Paul Martin, saying similar things, that not quite as strong, but China's making great progress and they're serious about the implementation of the rule of law and so forth, all while a genocide was unfolding in front of their eyes. So fortunately, we have a government now in Canada that has stood up to Beijing. And the fascists in Beijing are jumping up and down. They're very angry with the Canadian government at the moment, but so far the Canadian government has stood its ground.
But apparently human rights activists and human rights lawyers have different views about many governments' views about the human rights situation in China. And apparently for some people, governments or states are not that reliable, in order to try to force China to come to terms with the Western standards, or universal standards of human rights. When we come back, we'll talk about the human rights activist efforts in recent years in trying to improve the human rights situation in China, especially when it comes to the issue of Olympic Games in August in Beijing. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this message.